Welcome to week 7. This week we're going to be looking at the final days of the class. We're going to be looking at how we assessed what happened, what was the good, what was the bad, what was the ugly, and we're also going to look at some techniques for a successful end to our course. In week 8, we're going to look at how to end a class in a more general way. But in this lecture, I want to talk about some specific assessments or evaluations that need to be done in the final weeks of the class. Those assessments might include: how did the student support work? What kind of student support was offered? What was the access to resources? Did the students use those resources? Could they be improved? And finally, special services. So let me address each one of those for you. When we look at student support, we need to make sure that the student understands early on in the class that they're capable of completing the class. And that means several things. First, it means that they're capable of navigating the learning management system. And we talked about that in the early weeks of this class. But we have to assess that as the class is ending. Was the learning management system appropriate for this level of student? We also need to look at the students' computer skills. Are they able to save files, retrieve files? And then they have to have a base of knowledge that fits with the level of this class. So those are things that we might want to assess as we're looking at the end of the course. Did we do those things successfully? When we think about access to resources, those are many, many things to be taken into consideration, and I won't be able to cover all of those in this particular section of the lecture. But one of the things we need to make sure of is, in the beginning of the course, the student knows the minimum requirements for their computer. What is the minimum software? What is the minimum speed? What about the internet connection? Those are all things that really are the basic resources that the student needs. We also will be looking at library resources this week and trying to determine if the library is providing the necessary resources to our students so they can be successful. We can't forget tech support. As we continue to look at the resources being used in our course, it's important to look at the handouts we used, even the announcements, and even some of the emails that you wrote. Did those really convey the message that you wanted to have conveyed? Were they friendly and welcoming? And make sure that in some of those you've added a little bit of humor, because you want to kind of change up the course over the weeks that you have these students. So take a look at those resources you've provided and make sure they're top quality. We talked about tech support last week, but in the winding down days of a course, we need to look at how the students use tech support. How often did they use it, and were there some recurring questions? And if so, is there some upfront training that maybe needs to develop to help the students be better prepared for online learning? The last few weeks of the class is another good time to look at the communication. Not only the handouts that you gave to the students, but what about the announcements? What about the assignments, the way they were written? What about even your rubrics or emails? Determine if you like the format of what was sent out, and was the message what you wanted? Was it friendly and welcoming? Remember, we want to continue that friendly, welcoming attitude from day one all the way through the very end of the class. Also, think about the topics that you had to provide more information or more handouts on. Do those particular parts of the class need to be revised and maybe made more clear for the student? Every time I teach a class, I find that I revise my announcements. I want to make sure that those announcements convey the fact that I am the guide on the side. I am not the lecturer for this class. I'm here to be a facilitator of my students' learning. So those announcements continue to change from class to class. I want to read a statement to you, and this is really my belief. My belief is that every student in my class must have an equal opportunity to be successful. Let me explain why that is and how that's important in the final weeks of the class. That statement is especially important to me in the final weeks of my class. If I'm going to prepare for my next set of students, I have to look at the course I've just completed and determine where the pitfalls were. I need to create new handouts. Maybe I need to help with writing abilities. All of those handouts and all of those added resources need to be created now and ready for the next time I teach that class. I know that I have visual and auditory learners in my class, so at this point in the class, I like to look at adding more video and more audio. When you consider the specific needs of your students as you wind down your class, you might consider offering virtual office hours. That allows students to ask their specific questions in private and to get your immediate feedback. I also take a look at my question and answer section of my course. I make sure that I've been in there often and that I've answered the questions completely. Then I use both of those things, the questions the student asked me in office hours and those question and answers, to see where the class might need some revision. I think about that in these final weeks. In my final weeks, I like to look back at my welcome letter or my very first communication with the students. I suggested to you in week 1 that welcoming letter not give too much information about the class, but really share some information about you. Do you still agree with that now that we're reaching the end of the class? Are there things that you might have put in that welcome letter after you've taught the class one time? So think about that communication, the way you opened that class. Institutional issues are things like the calendar, start dates, due dates for assignments, and even record keeping for students. Let me give you an example of an issue that you may want to address with the administration. If you see that a lot of students are submitting their work late due to a holiday, you might bring that up at your next faculty meeting. The administration may not be able to change the calendar immediately, but at least you're being proactive and giving them that information. That might help support your future students. We want to always prepare our students so that they can have maximum learning in your course and in other courses that they teach. In order to do that, we have to evaluate every component in the class, and that usually takes place in the final weeks of your course. This is a good time to remind students that it is their responsibility to do the best they can in the class and to participate in the learning community. Teaching at a distance can be a challenge. As an instructor or an instructional designer, it's important to look at the content of the course and also how it's being delivered. Distance learning can be a challenge, but it can also be very pleasurable for both the student and the instructor. Keeping the class interesting and motivating helps the students remain active in the class. It's a valuable experience.